All right, hey everyone, this is Mr. W. This lesson is decimals part 4, equivalent fractions and decimals. The word equivalent means the same or equal. Equivalent fractions means that you have two fractions side by side that are equal in size, but the numerators and denominators are different. So, for example, here we have two fractions. The one on the left is 1/2. You can see the one is shaded out of 2. On the right side, we have 5/10, and we can see that we have a total of 5 shaded out of a total of 10. If I put tracing paper on top, we can say that equivalent fractions have the same size. And so here we have 1/2. And if I put this over, we can see that that 1/2 is exactly the same as the 5/10. The problem is that sometimes we don't have models and we just have the fractions and the numbers, and that can be confusing. We said that equivalent fractions have the same size, and we saw that, but the numerators and denominators are different. So for example, here we have the 1 is different from the 5, and on the bottom, the 2 is different from the 10. And sometimes people would say, well, that's not equivalent. So let me show you how we can prove that just with numbers. We would just take the 1/2 if we didn't have models, and we could multiply. And you would ask yourself, well, what times 1 would equal 5? And so that would be 5. So for example, on the top, 1 times 5 is 5, and on the bottom, 2 times 5 is 10. And you can see that the 1/2 is an equivalent fraction. So we showed it with models, and we showed it also how you can use multiplication to do that. Now, today's lesson will focus on how we can make equivalent fractions between the decimal place values of tenths and hundredths. Here you see we have a hundredths model and tenths, and when we say the place values, we're talking about our decimal place values to the right of the decimal point, and the first two is tenths and hundredths. So in other words, our job today is to show the equivalence between the fraction and decimal forms of tenths and hundredths. Okay, let's get started. Here we have a model of hundredths, 100 grids, and each of these 10 columns that go up and down are 10, and I'm seeing shaded blue would be 10, 20, 30. So if I write a fraction, that would be 30 hundredths. In decimal form, we would write that as 30 hundredths. Remember, in our place value, we said that when we read a decimal number, here we have 2, the 0 ends in the hundredths, so we would read this as 30 hundredths. In the tenths, I'm seeing 1, 2, 3 out of a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And in decimal form, 3/10 would be expressed as 0.3, which would read as 3/10. 31 hundredths and 3/10 are equivalent fractions. And also the decimal form are equivalent. In other words, they are equal. Now the thought is that, well, wait a second, that's 30 and that's 3. How can that be equal? And that's 100 and that's 10. How can that be equal? Let's use the tracing paper on the models to prove that again. And you can see here we have our 30 hundredths. And if we slide that over the 3/10, that is exactly the same size. Remember, we said on the first page that equivalent fractions are equivalent in the size of the shaded areas. So here we are absolutely fine, and we proved that. But we said that the numerator and denominators are different. So we just proved with our models that 30/100ths is equivalent to 3/10ths, whether it's in fraction form or in decimal form. Okay, the steps are real easy to do that. We don't always have models, but we can work with our fractions and decimals. When we go from tenths to hundredths, we just add a zero. And when you go from hundredths to tenths, we take away. Okay, let's try it. Write the number as hundredths in fraction form and decimal form. Okay, here we have 7/10ths, but we want to convert that to hundredths in fraction and decimal form. Well, we said is all we have to do is add a zero. So to turn 10 to hundredths, I add a zero. Whatever we do on the bottom, we have to do on the top. So 7/10ths would equal 70/100ths. And in decimal form, we would write that as 0.70, and that reads as 70/100ths. Remember that the 0 would end in the hundreds. Here we have decimal form, that would be 5/10ths, and our job is to turn this into hundredths. I think that's just easier to write 5/10ths. Most people kind of relate to that fraction 5/10ths, but our job is to write it as hundredths, and all we're going to do is add a zero. If we add it on the bottom, we must add it on the top, and then decimal form would be 50/100ths. Here, write the number as tenths in fraction and decimal form. Notice here that this time it is in hundredths in decimal form. So what we could do, we said just take away a zero. So that would be in tenths, 4/10ths. And then if I write 4/10ths, it sounds exactly like I said it, 4/10ths. So this would be 4/10ths, and in fraction form, 4/10ths. Here we have it in fraction form in hundredths, and we want to go tenths, and we just said to take away a zero. So 8/10ths and 8/10ths would be expressed in decimal form like that. Pause if you like and see if you can solve. Up here it says write the number as hundredths, these two as hundredths in fraction decimal form, and down here you want to go to tenths. Okay, how'd you do? All right, 5/10ths to go to hundredths, we add a zero, so that would be 100, and what we do on the bottom, we must add a zero on top, and then in decimal form, like that. Here we have decimal form in tenths, and what we want to do is go into hundredths, so I would just add a zero, and that would be 20/100ths, and then if I wanted to write that in fraction form, that would be 20/100ths. Here we want to go to tenths, is all we have to do. We said to take away a zero, so that would be 6/10ths, and if I write that 6/10ths is just write it exactly the way it sounds, 6/10ths, 6/10ths. Here we have fraction form. We just said to take away a zero. Make sure you do it both top and bottom. So we have 1/10 and 1/10. All right, everybody, thanks a lot. Hope this helps, and we'll see you next time.